I'm hoping, John, that there may be one or two people in this as well as just geology. So I hope that's not too disappointing. But
no, you go for it. Go for it, Ian.
So good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you all. As you all know, here in the WallCAP team, we've been looking at the relationship between a very particular part of the landscape and a particular architectural feature. And it's a relationship in terms of stone sourcing and dispersal, where it's come from, what it's about, and indeed the value of that piece of material in the way in which it's been reused after the event, as it were. And one of the things that we've been very lucky to do as part of the WallCAP team is to work with the Northumberland National Park at the Sill to put together an exhibition called Stories in Stone. And what I wanted to do with the talk, which I'm going to do just now, is to use some of the ideas from that Stories in Stone exhibition and to tell you a bit about it. So let's see if we can get this working. Here we go. Yes, excellent. Good. So here's a few pictures from the Stories in Stone exhibition. And I imagine Rob will be doing some more about this a bit later this afternoon as well. And the idea of the exhibition was to give some idea of the not only the geology of the landscape, the region around Hadrian's Wall, but also to look at the relationship between the wall, the landscape, and also the people within the landscape as well, and particularly a focus on some of the people who contributed to the Hadrian's Wall community archaeology project. So as those of you who have heard me talk before will know that I quite often give this introduction to when talking about geology. There are really three things which I find fascinating about geology. And the first of those is that when you look at geological objects, that they have a very tangible thing about them, that they're beautiful things to be able to pick up and hold in your hands. And they are beautiful things in their own right. And at whatever scale you look at them, so something which is hand-sized or microscopic, as per this thin section which has been taken of a gas bubble within a piece of volcanic rock, or indeed when you look at things at a landscape scale. So my first and probably the most important starting point for me in terms of geology is that it is very tangible, and it has an aesthetic and beautiful quality to it, which draws not only the soul but the mind in terms of understanding what it's about. There's a combination of beauty and intrigue about what geology and the objects that pertain to geology are about. So that's my starting point for geology. And the second part of that is that when you follow that thread of intrigue that those objects create, that it takes you into some epic stories about the age of the Earth, the vast amount of time, the way that the Earth works, the movement of plates around the surface of the Earth, the creation of oceans, volcanoes and earthquakes, and indeed things about who we are, where we've come from, the stories of evolution and what we're about. And some of those stories also have real resonance and meaning in terms of our practical everyday lives and in terms of what happens. So this is a picture of Hungatonga Hapai, which erupted again fairly recently, and understanding the way that the Earth works is actually kind of important to the way in which we live our lives. So that's the second part of why I think geology is exciting and interesting. It tells stories, and stories which have real meaning. The third part of it, and I guess this is probably the reason why I'm sitting here today and have been working on the WallCAP project, is about the relationship between geology and other things, and that the word which I find really useful to describe this is geodiversity. And geodiversity describes the relationship between geology and a whole bunch of things. And in my mind, maybe not everybody's, but certainly in my mind, geology is a fundamental subject and connects in a very fundamental way with all sorts of other subjects. So it relates to the landscape as already described. Rather a nice sunny morning just coming out of Kirk Newton the other day. It also relates to the soil, so that the soils that you find are directly connected to the geology that sits underneath them, and those in turn have an effect on agriculture and biodiversity. So the types of plants and animals that live and the ecologies that they form are founded on the geology that sits underneath them. It also relates to climate science. So our understanding of what has gone on historically in terms of climate change, we can discover by looking at the geology, and we'll come back to that later. It also tells us about evolution and the history of science, and indeed a little bit about a religion as well. And also it tells us about where we can find the resources which we use in order to be able to form the type of lives that we lead and the cultural environment in which we live. And also provide us with the building materials. So between those two, it provides us with the community, not only in terms of the community in which we live, but also the economic means by which those communities are actually formed as well. So where do we go from here? I'd like to go backwards in time, and what I would like to do is to explore some of these aspects of the relationship between us and the geology and the landscape and the way in which we've exploited it. And it seemed to me that this is a good place to start with these wonderful enigmatic marks that were made many thousands of years ago. And the landscape, particularly around in the area where I am in Kirk Newton. And this particular example is an old Buick, which my backdrop is not far from where this picture was taken. And you can see on here these extraordinary marks that have been made here, these circular cup and ring marks. And lots of question marks around what these are about and why they were made. And the relationship indeed between the stones and those marks. And this is quite a good example of it, in that it is not clear how many of these marks are actually marks which are made by humans, and certainly some of the clear circular marks are. But here we can see, let me see if I can find a decent pointer. There we go. So these marks in here look like they've been carved into it, but these radiating marks here, and indeed this channel which comes down here, might be man-made, but could equally well be natural. And I know that for some of these, that there are talks about these channels being about blood sacrifice and all sorts of other exotic things, which to me are an example of the way in which we find these fantastic objects, and then we can apply all sorts of really interesting creative thinking about it. But personally, I'm particularly intrigued by this relationship between what is man-made and what is natural. And I just wonder whether the people that came across these stones actually enjoyed the shape and the structure of these stones and interacted and responded to what they were seeing there. But also the other thing which is fascinating about these locations, and having been to one or two of them, and another example is at Lawdenshaw's, is the location of them. And the location is stunning in almost all of these examples. And I can't, again, help wondering whether the locations have a specific significance about them. Even if it is only at the level of when you go to a place like this, and this is something I'm going to talk a bit more about in a moment, you get a fantastic sense of perspective. It's something which is beyond the physical in terms of where you are. Our relationship with stone is clearly an old one. And one of the particularly fascinating pieces of stone, which I think talks to this in a very strong way, is flint. And here we have a lovely example of a Neolithic Flint Axe Head. And I think it's interesting to speculate as to what extent Homo sapiens interaction with tools and its way of, and what that actually meant in terms of our ability to be able to extend our immediate physical abilities to being able to hunt, to be able to work together, and to be able to tell stories to each other, which enabled us to be able to utilize those tools in a much more effective way, to be able to extend our capabilities. And these objects are not only fantastically useful, utilitarian in terms of what they do, but also beautiful as well. And not just flint as well. Flint obviously is something that we have a lot of in this country, but also obsidian is another material, volcanic material, rather than a chemical sedimentary material, which has also been used for this purpose. So these examples from Turkey here. And it is interesting how this relationship between things which actually have a very distinct function in terms of the flint object, excuse me, and the obsidian objects, which are used to hunt and also to be able to skin and dress, make clothes, and so on and so forth. But there is, again, this interaction between the functional and the beautiful and the cultural as well, and that we find that there is a movement towards objects like this, these extraordinary polished axes, which these are from the Karnak Museum, which may have a purpose, may have a function, but actually go beyond that in terms of having a cultural significance, but also significance in terms of trade as well. That they turn from something which is simply local and utilitarian into something which has a real cultural significance, and again extends the capability and extent of what we are doing as humans. And again, it's interesting our interaction with stone in some of these places of significance. And again, we don't know the precise meaning of these stone circles here at Dado Stones. But again, the location which has been chosen seems to me to be something which is of enormous significance. So a particular place within the landscape which has significance and beauty about it is then marked by humans in some way, and in a way which requires a really significant amount of effort in order to be able to place those stones within the environment. And we see that again here at the Castle Rig outside Keswick in the Lake District, a very similar sort of thing going on here, with some very specific stones which have been chosen to place in, again, in this extraordinary amphitheatre, which has a wonderful sense of place about it. And it's not just the ancients that get this sense of place as well. This for me is very much a personal example of the very same sort of thing. And this is from a trip which I took out to South America many years ago. And this is the volcano Licancabur, which sits on the border between Chile and a place to the north of Chile that's gone out of my head and will come back in just a moment. And this is Laguna Verde, looking up at Licancabur from not far from where I stopped in passing. And I was lucky enough to be able to ascend this mountain, which is over 5,000 meters at just over 19,000 feet. And it has to be said that when you get to the top, you get quite a nice view. And it is a place where I have to say that I found that sense of perspective, a sense of being able to see something beyond the physical and the tangible, but also very much mixed in with being able to see things on a scale where you could get a sense of the way in which the Earth is working, the sense of the movement of plate tectonics and the scale of mountains which that was capable of creating, and the rise of magma within a volcano which I'm sitting on top of here. It may also have been simply that there wasn't enough oxygen up there. But interestingly, that even in a remote place like that, there's human markings going on there, pieces of stone brought out there, pieces of wood, and other symbols of human presence in such an extraordinary place. And whilst this is a fairly extreme example of that sense, it is nonetheless something which I feel is really important in terms of the way in which we as humans interact within the landscape, and something that you can find on a daily basis just by going out into the Cheviot or up onto the wall. I also find it interesting that obviously standing on top of a volcano and getting this fantastic sense of place is a fleeting emotion. But I find it interesting that we seem as humans to want to be able to take some of those fleeting feelings and to be able to capture them and hold them and make them permanent. And that one of the ways in which we do that is within stone. So here's an example. These are the Kilted Magi, which again are about 100 yards away from me in St Gregory's Church in Kirk Newton. And this particular carving has, maybe speculatively, has been incorporated within the church and may originally have been part of the Anglo-Saxon settlement at Ardgefren just up the road from here. And that's wanting to capture the ephemeral in stone is something which is still very much a part of what goes on now. And here, this really lovely example of a sculpture, an interesting mixture of the delicate and the ephemeral caught within stone by Natasha Smith, who's the lady who some of you may have met and worked with, who came and helped us out on the WallCAP project and running stone carving workshops. And another medium which also is a product of the earth is clay, which we also use in a very similar sort of way. This lovely gentleman is in Timay, which is one of the suburbs, if you like, of Kathmandu and Kathmandu Valley, which is built on an old lake, which has vast amounts of clay. So Kathmandu, amongst other things, is a centre for clay making and production of various clay objects. And that is a history which goes back over a long period of time, back to the 12th century, with the Mala Kingdom and the Newar Empire, around which the Kathmandu is built. And this here in Bhaktapur, where they had some extraordinarily beautiful ceramic constructions mixed in with wood and bronze to create some amazing structures. And again, I find it interesting, this relationship between our desire to make things which are beautiful using the natural objects around us, but that also these have an absolute function about them. This looks a bit like Bedford, but actually is just outside Kathmandu and is one of the brickworks there, producing these very functional, practical objects. And that stone and brick are fundamental to the way in which we make our built environments, also for making tiles as well. And there are other geological objects which we have around us, which are used in that process of providing us as shelter. So here a really nice example of some slate being rived in a Welsh mine. And we also know from the work that we've been doing on Hadrian all the intimate relationship between stone and the way which is used to create some fantastic built structures. So here on the left, some stone from King Edward's Bay, just outside Tynemouth, and an archway within Tynemouth Priory, with an obvious relationship between those two objects. And also the lime mortar, which is used to hold these two together. So a nice example of lime mortar on the left here, bonding together Thirlwell Castle in this particular case. So a nice example of the lime mortar with some nice chunky bits of aggregate in there. which is obviously made from limestone. Here, a nice limestone pavement on the coast, Northumberland coast, and you just shove that into one of these, which is a banks, with a bit of coal around the outside of it, and away you go. You can produce calcium oxide, and which is then used in order to be able to stick walls together. And yes, we probably need to mention Hadrian's Wall somewhere in this presentation somewhere. So and we know that Hadrian's Wall is built of stone, and that it's built of sandstone for the most part. But we also know that it's not just a wall, but literally it is a wall with knobs on, as Rob will no doubt tell us later. So it's not just a functional object, it also has attracted all sorts of interesting other things around it in terms of the way in which it's decorated and made into something which is not only functional, but also beautiful, and maybe some spiritual content in that as well. And it's interesting, I recollect, and I've just reminded myself I was going to put an image of it as well, when Matt Simmons at the recent conference was talking about the wall and talking about some of the bizarre mile castles which sit on top of a cliff and clearly have no function whatsoever. However, they do actually mark out a location and a place which does have, again, something of that wonderful sense of place that some of these points within the landscape have. And it is also interesting the way in which some of these beautiful objects which have cultural significance imbued with them have taken on a significance which goes beyond the lifetime of the wall and is taken into other post-Roman structures. So here, a Roman altar which is being used as a font within the church at Charlton. The utility of stone goes well beyond its use as a building material. And the starting point for that particular adventure is with this material, coal. And coal is something that we use, has been used, still used sadly, to heat, to create power, which along with material like this, so this is a piece of ironstone on the Skers on Lindisfarne, which when you add it to coal and put it inside a blast furnace, and this is a picture by Philip Jacob Lothar of about 1801. This is Coalbrookdale, which is one of the very early centres in which iron was started to be constructed. And if you like, and interestingly, Shropshire being one of the original centres in which the Industrial Revolution was founded. But the natural resources which we get from the ground are fundamentally important to the way in which the Industrial Revolution happened, why it happened, centred in this country, and how it progressed from there. And it's not just about coal. Yes, before I talk about other things from coal, but one of the things that comes out of that blast furnace is steel and iron, and that is absolutely fundamental to the way in which the Industrial Revolution progressed. And indeed, we go beyond that to oil, a nice nodding donkey in Texas, and indeed to gas, and here a gas platform out in the North Sea. And those have enabled us not only to heat and look after ourselves and to power the Industrial Revolution, but also to create all sorts of interesting objects, material objects. Actually, plastic maybe not quite so interesting, but versatile and incredibly useful. And alongside those fundamental materials of the hydrocarbons, there are all sorts of other materials which are now powering an adventure into all sorts of objects and technologies, which are fundamental to the way in which we run our culture now. There is a finite limit to that, though, and this may be as an interesting warning from the past in terms of the way in which things will decay and change. So here is a lovely sandstone block that was put into Tynemouth Priory as a permanent reminder of a particular person, which we can see that the process of erosion has removed and taken away, leaving this rather fabulous object behind, which in time will decay and go away completely. And is, if you like, a reminder that the resources which we are using and extracting from the ground are finite, and also that by extracting and using some of those resources, that we are playing with our own future in terms of our time on the planet as well. And for those of you who've already read this month's newsletter, if you don't want to listen to the next section because you want to do some more research about what this particular mystery rock is, then do go and have a cup of tea for just a moment. So this is an ice core. This comes from a project that's been run out in Iceland, and they successfully drilled down to about over 3,000 meters into the Greenland ice, which what we're looking at here is layers of ice which mark changes in the amount of snowfall on an annual basis. And what these ice cores record is a history going back over thousands, almost towards millions of years. So a long and fascinating record of the Earth's past, and in particular of the Earth's climate, because within these ice cores are trapped small bubbles which contain samples of the atmosphere at the time which the firn was laid down. And we can use that information in order to draw up what is changing over time, and in particular the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And here is a graph of various different ice cores from various different places which show the way in which carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere is changing. And we've got this classic hockey stick shape with the right-hand side. So yeah, we're going from 1,000 years ago towards the present here into the 1900s. And in fact, if you follow that particular trend and where we are now, and this is back in the 1900s at about between 310, 320 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're now at a place where there is in excess of 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we know that there is a relationship from looking at the geological past. So, for example, looking at within the rocks, within the Carboniferous period, which underpin a lot of Hadrian's Wall, and particularly the area to the east of where I live. We know a lot about the relationship between carbon dioxide and the change in global climate that happens in consequence of that. And this is a thing that we have our future in our own hands, and that geology not only has provided the source of the materials which have caused the problems, but also has potentially some of the ways in which we can help deal with those particular problems. So here, for example, is some work which was done literally underneath Newcastle University in terms of drilling down into the layers of rock beneath the university and tapping into the heat flow which you get. There is a geothermal gradient almost wherever you go on the Earth, and some places that heat flow is stronger and weaker, and within the rocks underneath Newcastle University it is somewhere in between strong and weak, and so that there is a possibility of being able to source heat from this geothermal energy rather than from fossil fuels. So this is one route to be able to solve this particular problem. Another is in terms of taking some of the carbon dioxide which is within the atmosphere, fixing it and placing it back within the ground in a way which means that it will not be able to get back out to the surface again within timescales which mean that it is useful to do that. And there are various ways of doing that, and one of those, and again this is really interesting, the way in which we are using the knowledge which has been found through exploration and exploitation of oil and gas through drilling, that we know a lot about underground structures, and we can exploit that knowledge in order to be able to return some of the carbon dioxide. So that, for example, in both oil and particularly gas wells, that these impermeable seals in structures were what you would look for because they are where gas and oil would have been trapped, which you can then drill into and extract that hydrocarbon. They also provide a route by which you can put that carbon dioxide back in, and that carbon dioxide can then be trapped within, again, that impermeable seal that originally would have been there trapping the gas and oil which we extracted. Now, there are different ways in which that carbon dioxide can be trapped. So by having it sealed in that way, and some experiments have been actually done. So this is from a hydrocarbon field out in Norway, Sleipner, which carbon dioxide has been pumped down into that field over many years, since 1994. And you can see the various colours in here show the gradual increase in the amount of carbon dioxide which is being trapped within that reserve, and starting to demonstrate that it is possible to do this in a way which is successful and over a significant period of time. And it's not just about it being held there by those impermeable layers, but also, and this is some work which Stuart Jones and his colleagues at University have been doing, is to actually show that the carbon dioxide can actually react with minerals which are within the sandstones in this particular case, so that rather than just being held by this impermeable layer so it can't come back out to the surface, it's actually chemically reacting with clay minerals in particular, and particular clay minerals that react in different ways with the carbon dioxide, so that it is permanently held within that sandstone for much longer periods of time in consequence of this. And this is a really beautiful set of pictures of some of those clay minerals taken really high levels of magnification with some fantastic bits of technology. And I have to say that I absolutely love this picture for this combination of the way in which, going back right to the beginning of the presentation, the way in which that intrigue, that fascination to understand what the rocks can actually tell us continues to fascinate us, and to fascinate us in a way which will help solve some very practical problems. But also mixed in with this, we've got this extraordinary technology. This is wonderful modern technology we can use in order to be able to get at that, but also that it creates images which are beautiful. They're just, I find it absolutely fascinating, the structures and textures and colours which these pictures reveal as well. And I suppose that I would like to conclude by saying that that I hope this has given you a bit of a flavour of the fascinating interaction of geology and landscape with all sorts of many other things, but that also to say that this particular line of reasoning and thought is something which is really important in terms of how we take into our own hands our future, so that we can make sure that we can continue doing this sort of thing, and that it is possible to enable a sustainable planet which we can have this human and landscape interaction. And it's a very final thing. this again from the Sala de Uyuni, not far from where from the volcano de Lagankabur, that this is an extraordinary planet, and it is something which it is very worthwhile making sure that we can make it sustainable. So at that point, I will say thank you very much indeed. And if you've got any questions, be more than happy to try and answer them.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you for that. I don't know whether everybody wants to give Ian a quick round of applause. I thought as much, either virtually or real. Ian, you've done it again. I've been fascinated by the whole talk, and you managed to slip in humans all the way through that conversation again. I think it's just the amazing way that you bring rocks into the holistic picture and explain it in the round. I find that absolutely terrific, and so thank you again for captivating me for a whole hour. I wasn't aware that I was chairing anything for the time when you were talking just there.
Great, thank you, John.
I'm going to have a look in the chat to see if there are any questions. I suspect everybody was in exactly the same place as I was, which was listening mode during the course of that. Apparently the country, according to David Bruff, that you were searching for was Peru. Is that correct?
No, it's not. It's the next one down onto the right, and I don't know quite why it's gone out of my head, but it has.
We'll hunt it later on. Guys, are there any questions for Ian? Please raise a hand or try and make yourself known. I've got to look across two screens, so if I don't see you straight away, just keep persisting and shouting out. Have I got a hand somewhere? Did I see? Oh, Chloe. Hi, Chloe. Are you okay? What's your question?
Hi, I just wanted to say that was really inspirational. I loved that. Wow, so wide-ranging as well.
Sorry.
So I think because obviously you've got there's the sort of artistic side of this and the scientific side, but my own work is all around materials and the scientific analysis of them. But you just really got me thinking about the landscape, and I think it's that kind of rise and fall. So I don't know how much, I don't know what you think, but about the kind of, if I like to go walking along the beaches. And you can pick up sea glass, you can pick up ceramics, and some of the beaches along the Northumberland coast, they also have bricks, like full bits of brick buildings or pillboxes or whatever, with the mortar still there, but they've been then eroded by the sea, and they sort of become geological again. And so things like the glass as well. And I just thought that was what your talk kind of made me think about that in a different way. So I'm not sure that's really a question, but it was something that you kind of inspired, and I thought, oh, it's that kind of, and also with the carbon sinks as well, it's about things going back into the geology, isn't it? Which is ultimately what will happen, I suppose. But yeah, it's really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that what you say about the way in which man-made objects are now becoming a part of the modern sedimentary life cycle. That a geologist, if there is such a thing in 50 million years, coming back and looking at the geological sediments which are being laid down now, will see this admixture of anthropogenic material within those layers, yeah, it lends weight to the idea that we're now within the Anthropocene.
There are several words in that conversation which I'm now going to have to go and Google while you lot have a conversation.
Sorry, John, can I just say, Bolivia is the word I was looking for.
I was going to say to David, who's written in the chat, just shows you how little I know. David, it's a huge continent. He was looking for one mountain. Don't beat yourself up about it. It's easily done. Only thing I know about Peru is Paddington Bear. Beyond that,
Indeed.
It goes off. So, there you go. Thank you for clarifying that. We have a question from Jane Gibson about the entropy on the wall. Look, I tried to fit in a big word there. Effect on the wall, and how long will the sandstone of the wall last? How long am I going to be writing a management plan for, basically?
Yeah. I think, given the man-made attention the wall is getting, that it will probably last a little while longer. I mean, certainly, it's lasted a couple of thousand years already. And given that at the moment we are set on preserving what is left of the wall, assuming that we continue to do that, the rate of geological erosion is going to be slow in comparison with the rate at which stone was actually nicked from it by humans in previous incarnations. So there's no reason why it shouldn't last for many, many thousands more years on that basis. Mm-hmm. It is an interesting question in that one of the mysteries which I think still remains unsolved is particularly what's happened to the material in the western end of the wall, where the sandstone that was used in order to construct the wall may have been less durable than the material that you find within the central and eastern section of the wall. And certainly, as Catherine will confirm, that the material that we found, for example, in the dig at Cambeck Crossing, some of the sandstones there were awful, were really shoddy, and just crumbled in your hand. And it may be that some of the reason why some of the wall in the western section is disappeared is because it has already eroded away. Okay. But given that the quality of sandstone in the central and eastern section is of the standard at which it is, I think we have a long time to go. Exactly how long that is, very hard to say, but we're definitely talking about many thousands of years.
I may need a longer contract, Jane, in that sense. Neil, in answer to your question, yes, I'm from Yorkshire. I'm not putting the heating on, so I'll go and get a cardie in a minute. So, and are there any other questions for Ian while he is here?
Actually, I do, John. I do have another question. Did the Romans have geologists? Did that, was there a practice that we know in Roman society, which was the study of geology?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think there are other authorities around who probably know more about this than I do, but the only person who I know of that has really written about geology at the time is Pliny. And his approach to, in quotation marks, very big quotation marks, science is interesting, and it falls into two parts. The one is that he is an extraordinary collector of anecdotes, and some of those anecdotes just are extraordinary in their breadth, some of which are just hilarious to read these days. And are just that, they are anecdotes, old wives' tales, nonsense in many cases. But also some of them are actually more interesting, maybe more real. But the other part of what he did was he documented in considerable detail around mining methods, methods of exploiting raw materials from the ground, about smelting and metal production and all sorts of things. So an interesting combination of things, but I think, as we see from quite a lot of the Roman ethic, that what they were primarily interested in was the use of the raw materials for functional purpose, be that constructing walls or carving knobs, whichever it was. It was a very practical interest in the material, rather than an interest in understanding what those rocks could tell us about the processes by which they're formed and the way in which the earth works.
I'd echo that as a prehistorian, Ian. Even though we don't have anything written down for that particular period, you know that there's an understanding of the properties of that material and its use, which often I think far outweigh our understanding of natural materials and their current uses. So when you look at the wooden collection at Vindolanda, for example, and the way that they've chosen and used the wood, there's an intimate knowledge of the properties of those individual wood species that align to the purpose that they're looking for in terms of density, strength, robustness, etc. And I can't imagine that it's any different for stone in that sense. There's a great working knowledge, because that is the technology of the time in the way that we understand the different properties of plastics to this at this moment in time. But I haven't got the foggiest when it comes to different types of trees, because it's not something that I interact with on a regular basis. David, you have your hand up. Is there a question there?
Really just a point of information for Ian, or to ask him, is he aware of the work done by our friend and colleague Sven Bittner in Bavaria? Sven is a geologist who's been doing extensive research on Roman mortars and the geology of different Roman mortars, and the recipes, if you like, for Roman mortars. If not, we can put you in touch with Sven very readily.
Thank you. No, I wasn't aware of the work he was doing, and I'd be very grateful if you could put me in touch with it. That'd be very much appreciated.
Thank you, David, for reminding me about Sven. I have to, whenever he's in this country, I have to check his pockets on a regular basis, because I'm sure we lose a little bit of Hadrian's Wall each time he comes.
John, sorry, can I just come back on to Jane's question again? Because there is another aspect to this, and this is the what I was talking about at the beginning about the aesthetic interest in geological objects, and certainly that was very much a thing for Romans, and that you see as an immediate example that they use things like agates within jewellery, and that is a fascination which we see, if you like, as amateur geologists, that there is still an enormous collector's market for agate jewellery, but also for geologists going out and collecting agates.
Yeah, indeed, and I think it's important to give that equal weighting. It's often overlooked, that aesthetic value in that sort of sense. Can you see the chat, Ian? And Bill's put a comment in there about the use of red sandstone and its properties. So, you know, something that goes through time in that sense.
Yes, it's interesting, and really comes back to what you were saying, John, about our relative knowledge about these things. That I mean, I find it fascinating that some of the sandstone that's been used within Tynemouth Priory is decomposing and falling apart, whereas there are extensive sections of the Roman wall which still look like they were built yesterday in comparison, and that it may be an economic consequence that that cheaper sandstones were used within some of these buildings, but it may also be that we've in the tenements in the 1980s, it may be purely an economic thing, but it may also be that we've lost some of the knowledge that the Romans had around what is good stone to use in the first place.
There's another question just popped up in the chat from Neil.
That's an interesting question. I certainly don't know, my frontinus. So if there's anybody else out there.
And then Chloe, yeah, you've got in with Chloe. Do you want to say that out loud rather than me read that out while you're here, basically?
Sure. Yeah. No, I was just thinking. I was really interested in that question about geology. I was thinking that if we're looking for geologists, and I don't know, Ian, if you would count this as a definition of geology, because as you say, you know, it's about understanding it. But when you look at the work that miners, prospectors for mines, particularly for metals and other minerals, but also surveyors, I think our geologists would be among these practical people. And of course, in the Roman period, they're not the ones writing things down. So I feel almost as though there's probably they must have had some theoretical body of knowledge, which we maybe can't access. Although, as somebody said, I think Pliny tends to write quite a lot of maybe what seem like anecdotes, but might be part of that theoretical body of knowledge. I don't know, though, whether that would count as geology.
I would certainly see it that way. I have to say that, and it's something that my old geology professor said repeatedly, that a geologist is only as good as the number of rocks they've seen. And I think it's not just seen, but also got involved in a very tactile way with us as well. And that it's fascinating. And when talking to the guys that run Lady Cross Quarry, and indeed at Barrowsford as well, their knowledge and interest, they use, interestingly, a slightly different language in the way in which they describe the geology, but a very intimate and thorough understanding of geology. And also, if we go back in history as well, you talk about William Smith, the first person who put together a geological map of the British Isles. That his starting point, you know, he was a mine inspector, and that a lot of his knowledge about the relationship between fossils and the fossil ages and the strata, and how you could therefore define those different strata in terms of their age, was based on miners' knowledge. So yeah, absolutely, totally agree that you know, there is a huge amount of geological knowledge built within quarry workers and within miners and the way they operate. It's
those practical skills, isn't it, that we sort of, well, not us, but socially, that they're seen as divorced from science somehow. But and it's such a shame. I guess as archaeologists and geologists, we know how important practical stuff is. But
absolutely, and it's one of the reasons. It's one of the reasons why, in consultation with Kerry, that we brought on board Natasha to come and run some of these stone carving workshops, because what it meant is it gave an opportunity for the volunteers to actually get an understanding of what stone actually feels like and what it feels like to use it, which in a very practical way gives you an insight into what stone is about in a way that me standing here and talking about it doesn't do any justice to.
We've got a couple of questions popped up in the chat while we were having that discussion. I've got suspicion that we don't know of Vitruvius that well to be able to say whether there's any geology in there or not, but we will find a man that can, to quote the advert. And Barbara asks, is there anywhere in the Roman Empire with similar geology to here?
Cool. That's quite a big question. Interestingly, the Antonine Wall has some similarities in terms of the geology. So part of the Antonine Wall also crosses Carboniferous sedimentary rocks, and indeed also crosses some of the Permo-Carboniferous igneous intruded material like the Wind Sill. As far as the rest of the wall is concerned, I'm mentally sort of walking my way around the wall and seeing if I can actually give you a decent answer to that. I'm not sure that there is. When we go through the lowlands and out into Bavaria, we're looking at rocks which are rather younger than the Carboniferous. So there are sedimentary rocks, so sandstones and limestones, which will be available. And then when you get out further around, we're starting to go into a rather more complex mixed terrain, which includes a whole bunch of heavily metamorphosed and igneous rocks, which are really quite complex, which are quite dissimilar from what we're looking at along Hadrian's Wall. You know, I'm just trying to think about the North African side of things and what there is there. I'm not sure what the geology is that underpins that particular part of the world, so I'm not going to attempt to describe that because I'll be making it up. There's some interesting geology in Egypt. There's some fascinating stuff that goes on there in terms of much more ancient rocks. So we're going back into really old billion-year material. So a very good question, and you know, it's something that I think there's much more exploration in the limes as a whole to understand whether the relationship that we see in Hadrian's Wall here, which has probably been explored more thoroughly than that relationship has been done in any other part of the limes. I think it will be something that will be very interesting to explore more thoroughly.
Absolutely, and so something to bring to something like Limes Congress or something like that, so that we can see what's been done elsewhere across the frontiers and see whether there's any commonality in terms of architecture and responses to the landscape. Because whenever we talk about geology in context of archaeology, it always brings me back to the phrase where I'm about to hammer Shakespeare. It always occurs to me that all the world's a stage and we're just actors upon it. The whole geology that's underneath our feet dictates what we eat, what we do, where we live, how we operate. I think it's the start of whatever we do, and if it's not of the geology, take deep mining for example, it's a temporary state of affairs. It quickly operates and then disappears again, almost like the world wipes it clean, you know. So yeah, I always think of geology as that stage on which we act out our lives over the course of eons in some senses. And I think you do that repeatedly when you explain geology, and you have that holistic view rather than disappearing down sort of a chemical formula view and a crystalline shape and all that sort of stuff, which, as you say, has no people in it and far too many noughts. Ian, thank you very much again for your time. Thank you for your energy. Thank you for your enthusiasm. And can we give him a final round of applause?